Hey everybody, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. This is your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia, and it's where I teach anatomy and physiology, and I've been doing that since 2002. I'm glad to have you back. We did take a week off last week. I just was real busy with other things and just did not have time to get the episode up for you last week, so I'm glad to have you back so we can continue on with blood vessels. Before we do that, I want to thank a listener for writing me a question. And that listener's name is Rudy. And Rudy listens from Croatia. Rudy asked if I could do some episodes on the skeletal muscular system in the context of physiotherapy. I really appreciate this question, and I do understand what people are looking for when they're listening to this podcast. Most of you are studying to be clinicians of some kind, and having specific episodes dedicated to your field of study would be really helpful. However, one, I'm not a physiotherapist, so I'm not sure how good that episode would actually be. And two, I'm not choosing the episodes in that manner. If you've been listening for a while, you'll recognize that these episodes are going in order of a typical 2-semester anatomy and physiology textbook. So the way that a course runs in A&P is the order that I am recording these episodes. So if you are looking at a textbook that is commonly used in A&P, and let's say it is Saladin or McKinley or Marib or Tortora or Martini, you'll notice that I'm somewhere around chapter 18, 19, 20, somewhere in that range, depending on which book you're using. And I'm going to keep going in this direction until I get through to the end of the content for a typical A&P course. At which point, I'm not really sure which direction I'm going to go. I have had some ideas of maybe going into a pathology direction and dedicating episodes from that point on to particular diseases, conditions, and injuries that affect the organ systems, especially the ones that are the most clinically significant and the ones that are the most commonly encountered by a clinician. In those episodes, I'll probably get into treatment and what is the typical treatment for those kinds of conditions. So this might be coming, but I will say, Rudy, it's very likely that it's going to be a while before we get there. We've got essentially what amounts to about 10 to 11 chapters left to go. And I usually spend a few episodes on each chapter. So it's going to be a while. But thank you for your question, and hopefully you can find what you're looking for, and hopefully what I'm doing here is still helping you. Having said that, let's get back into blood vessels, and we're going to specifically get into blood pressure, we're going to start off with hydrostatic blood pressure. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term blood pressure before. It's among the most clinically significant aspects of the circulatory system. And we usually hear it in the context of blood pressure being high. We hear about it as a pathology. But it is essential. Without hydrostatic blood pressure, we can barely get blood to where we need it to get from our heart. Now, yes, when blood pressure is too high, it can make us sick, but it can also make us sick when it's too low. Remember that your blood has to go against gravity to get to your brain. So without the force of blood pressure, we can't overcome the force of gravity. So we should talk a little bit about what pressure is. In our atmosphere, particles are always moving. Anytime you have a volume of matter enclosed within a chamber, a vessel, or some kind of system, it's going to exert a pressure on the walls of that system. Think about a pot of water. When you have a pot of water on a stove, you put the water in the pot, and the walls of the pot provide resistance to letting that water just flow all over the stove. So the water is putting a pressure against the walls of that pot. Now, the walls of the pot are strong enough to overcome that pressure so it doesn't just break apart. But those water molecules are moving, and they're hitting up against the wall of that pot. So there is a hydrostatic pressure in there. If we heat that water up, we increase the speed at which those particles are moving. And these particles I'm talking about are water molecules. They move faster and faster and exert more and more pressure on the walls of the pot. Now, if you keep increasing the heat, what's going to happen is those molecules are going to move so fast that they're going to jump into the air and become water vapor or steam. And that increases the volume of this matter, of the original pot of water we put on there. If you have a lid on that pot, the more you heat it up, the more that lid is going to start dancing up and down on top of the pot. That's because you have created a pressure inside the pot that is greater than the gravity holding the lid onto the pot. And one pressure is overcoming the other pressure, and the pot lid is starting to dance up and down. This is just an example of a fluid in a closed system exerting a pressure on the walls of that system. The same thing is happening in your blood vessels. Now, don't worry about the heating up. We're not going to turn your blood into steam and water vapor and things like that. So we don't have to worry about heating it up too much. But we know that when that blood is moving, it's not just moving, let's say, from your shoulder to your fingertips in your arteries. It's also trying to move out against the walls of the arteries. It's those walls of the arteries that are providing the resistance to make sure the blood goes in the direction, not unlike a garden hose. Without the garden hose, water would just come bursting out of the spigot all over the patio. But if you put the hose on there, you provide resistance so that the water flows where you want it to flow. The more you open up the water spigot, the more water you put in that vessel or garden hose, and the more pressure is exerted on it. That's what hydrostatic pressure is. We measure hydrostatic pressure in units called millimeters of mercury because of how far a volume of mercury in a tube is moved by changes in pressure. Now, blood flow is the amount of blood moving through a vessel, tissue, or organ over a period of time, and we measure that in millimeters per minute. Larger organs typically need more blood than smaller ones for obvious reasons, so we also measure the blood flow relative to the mass of the tissue it's supplying. This is called perfusion, and we measure that in millimeters of blood per 100 grams of tissue per minute. Perfusion is how we determine if an organ or tissue is getting the blood it needs. So think about your liver. Your liver is a very large organ. It's on the right side of your abdominal cavity, superior. It's just under your diaphragm, and it's much larger than a kidney or a gallbladder. So its perfusion rate is going to be relative to how large it is. And that's why we use 100 grams of tissue per minute rather than just the organ as a whole, because it's going to take more blood flow to perfuse a larger organ than a smaller organ. The main drivers of blood pressure are the force with which the heart pumps blood into the vessels and that resistance of the walls of the blood vessels that keeps the blood from spilling all over the place. When the heart pumps, and we haven't gotten to the heart yet, but the heart is a muscular pump. It is made of cardiac muscle, and the chambers of it fill with blood, and then the muscle of those chambers contract, squeezing the cavity of those chambers down. Much like if you had a water balloon and the end was untied and you squeezed the water balloon and you would shoot the water out the end. As the heart muscle squeezes the blood in its chamber, that blood has to go somewhere. And it goes to whichever outlet is open. And we'll talk more about that as we go on, but I don't want to give too much away on heart because we haven't gotten there yet. But keep in mind that the main driver of blood pressure is the pumping action of the heart. Remember, the main driver of water pressure in your garden hose is opening the water spigot and allowing more water in. The main driver of blood pressure is pumping the heart muscle and pushing more blood in. Now, when a heart contracts, we call that systole. You've probably heard of systolic blood pressure. When the heart is relaxed, we call that diastole. So, since the heart pumps during systole, the blood pressure in the arteries is greater during that phase of a cardiac cycle. Since the heart is relaxed during diastole, which is in between beats, the blood pressure is typically lower during diastole. And that's usually how we measure it. We can use what's called a sphygmomanometer, and we put a certain amount of pressure around the brachial artery, which is the artery of your upper arm that comes down through your elbow and before it branches into arteries of your forearm. We can put a blood pressure cuff, which we call a sphygmomanometer. We can put that around the brachium, which is your upper arm, and fill it with air so that it's exerting a certain amount of pressure around the brachial artery. When the pressure being exerted on the outside of the brachial artery is greater than the blood pressure in the brachial artery, the pulsing action is going to stop. You won't hear a beat anymore or a pulse in that artery because you've squeezed it down so that you've overcome the pressure forcing the blood through that artery. So we listen to that with a stethoscope. And what we can hear is the pumping action when we equal the pressure in the cuff versus the systolic pressure in the artery. And then the last beat you hear is where you've matched the diastolic pressure. And then you don't really hear anything anymore. So we can use this to determine the pressure when the heart is beating, the systolic pressure, versus the pressure when the heart is in between beats, the diastolic pressure. And we measure that as, let's say, 110/70. And it's in millimeters of mercury. So 110 millimeters of mercury is the systolic pressure, and 70 millimeters of mercury is the diastolic pressure. And that's what those numbers mean when you hear those reported from a typical vital sign check. Now, the maximum amount of stress that the beating heart puts on small arteries is called the pulse pressure, and it's calculated by subtracting the diastolic pressure from the systolic pressure. In our example of, let's say, 120 millimeters of mercury over 70 millimeters of mercury, you would subtract 70 from 120, and that would give us 50 millimeters of mercury. That's the pulse pressure. Now, as you can imagine, the smallest of arteries are the arteries that are most vulnerable to high pressure because their walls are thinner, they're not as strong. So this is a good, important check clinically to see what kind of force we're putting on these small arteries. Now, we can also measure the force exerted on our blood vessels over the course of one typical cardiac cycle. Now, one cardiac cycle is the time from the beginning of one heartbeat all the way to the beginning of the next heartbeat. So a cardiac cycle encompasses both systole and diastole. If we're going to look at the average amount of pressure that an artery is going to be under over the course of one cardiac cycle, then we have to consider that diastole is typically about 3 times longer than systole. So the higher of the two pressures, the systolic pressure, is only being exerted for about 1/3 of the time as the diastolic pressure. So we can't just average 120 and 70 together and come up with what we call a mean arterial pressure. Mean means average. What we have to do is estimate based on the fact that the actual heartbeat takes about 1/4 of a second, and in a typical average heart rate of about 72 beats per minute, we're looking at about a 0.8 second cardiac cycle. So that's about 3 times. So here's what we do to measure mean arterial pressure. First, we take our pulse pressure, and in our example, it was 50 millimeters of mercury. When we divide that by 3, it comes to about 16 or 17, somewhere in between. So we'll use 17 to keep it simple. The diastolic pressure is the baseline pressure that our arteries are under when the heart's in between beats. So that's always going to be there. So we have to add the pulse pressure divided by 3 to our diastolic pressure. So in our example, our diastolic pressure was 70 millimeters of mercury. Our pulse pressure was 50 millimeters of mercury. So 50 divided by 3 is between 16 and 17. We'll use 17. And we add that to our diastolic pressure of 70 millimeters of mercury. 70 plus 17 is an estimated mean arterial pressure of about 87 millimeters of mercury in this example. Now, thanks to gravity, the mean arterial pressure is much higher in a standing person's calves than in their brain. Gravity is also a force that we have to consider. The mean arterial pressure is clinically significant because the pressure during diastole is as important, if not more important, as during systole. Because the elastic tissue of the medium and large arteries allows them to expand during systole, absorbing some of the force from the pulse. But also, because of that elastic tissue, they recoil back to their resting size and shape, helping to continue to squeeze blood through the vessel between heartbeats. The loss of this elasticity from age, diet, lack of exercise, genetics, or other causes can result in uncontrolled blood pressure, which puts the smaller arteries at greatest risk for damage. Now, as you can imagine, the further the blood gets from the heart, the lower the blood pressure is going to be. So hydrostatic blood pressure is highest in the aorta, which is the first vessel coming out of the left ventricle of the heart, and gradually declines as it reaches the large arteries, the small arteries, the arterioles, capillaries, venules, small veins, large veins, and then eventually the vena cava, which are the largest veins delivering blood directly into the right atrium. Now remember, in addition to the pumping action of the heart and the volume of blood in the vessels themselves, the resistance that the vessels themselves impose on blood is a great determinant of the pressure and flow of blood itself. This is called peripheral resistance, and it takes into consideration the radius of the vessel, the viscosity or thickness of blood, and the length of the vessel. Now, if you think about the changing radius or diameter of a blood vessel, so in case you're not familiar, when you have something that is circular, like an artery in cross-section is circular, the diameter is the distance across that circle as long as that line runs through the center of the circle, all the way from one wall to the other wall. The radius is half that. The radius is the distance from the wall to the center of the circle. Now, when these vessels get narrower for whatever reason, then we're going to change how much blood can flow through those vessels. And we're probably going to change the pressure because we increase the resistance. If you think about coronary artery disease, which is the #1 cause of death in the world for both biological males and females, coronary artery disease is when the arteries that supply your heart muscle with its own blood supply, which we call the coronary arteries, become stenotic. Stenotic means the diameter of the vessel has decreased. It's gotten narrower, which means that one, blood flow can't get through as quickly, so blood flow goes down, which means the tissues that are supplied by that artery are not getting all of the oxygen and nutrients that they need. And it also means that a blood clot of a particular size is at a higher risk for blocking that artery. And if that artery is completely blocked by a blood clot, then that tissue gets no blood, which we call ischemia, and then the oxygen levels go down, which we call hypoxia, and then the tissue dies, which we call an infarct. And if it's in the heart muscle, which we call the myocardium, it's a myocardial infarction, which is basically a heart attack. And this is the #1 cause of death in the world. There is a mathematical equation to determine the resistance to blood flow. Let's say you have an artery that is 50% occluded, which means that its diameter is 50% of what it was, because genetics, high blood cholesterol, a diet high in saturated fats, a lack of exercise, or what we would call a sedentary lifestyle, The existence of already having high blood pressure, diabetes, cigarette smoking, all of these can cause what we call plaque formation in the arteries that gets under the endothelium and protrudes into the lumen of the artery, making the artery narrower. We call that atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis, and it is the cause of coronary artery disease. So again, let's say you have a 50% blockage of the artery. You would imagine that the blood flow to the tissues that artery supplies is half of what it was before. Well, let's use this mathematical equation to figure out exactly how much the blood flow has decreased because of that 50% blockage. The mathematical formula we use is called Poiseuille's law, and it pertains to peripheral resistance in the circulatory system. The resistance to blood flow increases as the radius of a vessel decreases, which you probably suspected. What you may not have guessed is that the proportional increase in resistance is calculated by taking the change in radius to the fourth power. Let's consider an example where we're really only concerned with the proportional change in resistance and flow as vessel radius changes. So we'll use a measure of 1 for the viscosity, length, and constants in this equation because they're not going to change when a vessel constricts or dilates. If a vessel has a radius of 2 millimeters in our example, the resistance would have a measure of 1/16 of a liquid ohm. That's because the radius is in the denominator of the equation, and we take that radius to the fourth power, which means 2 times 2 equals 4, times 2 equals 8, times 2 again equals 16. So we end up with a resistance of 1/16 of a liquid ohm. That's the units we measure it in. If that vessel is cut in half to 1 millimeter, we take that to the fourth power. 1 times 1 equals 1, times 1 equals 1, times 1 again equals 1, which means our resistance is 1 whole liquid ohm. Before it was 1/16. Now the resistance has increased by a measure of 16 times what it was before. And since flow is the inverse of resistance, that means blood flow has decreased by 16 times what it was before when the vessel radius was cut in half. That's enormous. Now, not only is that a big clinical significance because of atherosclerosis, but also with our vessels, like our arterioles, we can constrict and dilate them to the tissues based on the tissue's need for blood and oxygen at any given time. We only have a certain amount of blood that we can send to our body's tissues. So we have to prioritize which tissues need the blood the most at any given time. So we can divert blood away from tissues that don't need it and toward tissues who do by using vessel radius, by having the smooth muscle of the tunica media of arterioles and small arteries. We can constrict and decrease blood flow tremendously, and we can dilate and increase blood flow tremendously. Now, when that happens as a disease process, we lose control. And now we've decreased blood flow to certain tissues, and we can't get it back. That's the hard part. And this is why atherosclerosis, or coronary artery disease, is the leading cause of death in the entire world. Okay, now remember that perfusion is the amount of blood that goes into an organ per time. And the way our bodies control perfusion to our different organs is by changing blood pressure and blood flow to the tissues. We do this with quick, powerful reflexes known as vasoreflexes. And the effectors of those reflexes are the blood vessels. When we talk about the constriction and dilation of a blood vessel, we call that vasomotor activity, and it's controlled by 3 different mechanisms. There's a local mechanism, there's a neural mechanism, and a hormonal mechanism. We also call the local control autoregulation, which means the tissues themselves are actually influencing their own blood supply. So let's start with the local control first. The more active a tissue is, the more oxygen it uses, and the more metabolites like carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, potassium ions, lactate, and adenosine will begin to accumulate in the tissue fluid. That low oxygen and high metabolites stimulate vasoreflexes, resulting in vasodilation. Now remember, we talked about the formula that shows us that increasing the diameter of a vessel greatly increases blood flow, and that helps to deliver the needed oxygen and remove the waste. So as the tissues become more active, their chemical scenario that's created from that is actually determining how much blood flow will come into those tissues. So the more active the tissue is, the more dilated their arteries get, and the more blood they're going to get. As the conditions reverse and the tissues become less active, we constrict the vessels, called vasoconstriction, and that's going to lower the blood flow. This local feedback system allows a tissue to control its own blood supply or perfusion based on its own needs at any given time. And that's why we call it local control. I like to say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. We have X amount of blood that's available to pump throughout our body at any given time. So we want to make sure that the tissues that need it the most are getting it. And this is one of the ways we do that. You can actually see local control happening when tissues are inflamed. So, like if there's, let's say, an injury, or when you're exercising, biochemicals like histamine, bradykinin, and prostaglandins are considered to be vasoactive because they also stimulate vasodilation. They're released by platelets, the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, and the tissues surrounding the blood vessels. We can also observe local control when we see a tissue whose blood supply has been disrupted for a little bit and then restored. A phenomenon called reactive hyperemia occurs, which means an excessive amount of blood flows into the tissue to remove the accumulation of metabolites and make up for the hypoxia that occurred during the time of disruption. If the hypoxia lasts for a longer bit of time, we might see angiogenesis, which is when new blood vessels form to provide the tissue with an ample blood supply. Neural control refers to the influence the nervous system has on blood pressure. The medulla oblongata of the brainstem utilizes its vasomotor center and the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system to control the blood vessels all over our body. Most blood vessels narrow in response to sympathetic stimulation, but the coronary arteries dilate, so the myocardium of the heart gets the extra blood it needs during exercise. 3 different autonomic reflexes run through the medulla's vasomotor center. They are the baroreflexes, the chemoreflexes, and the medullary ischemic reflex. Baroreflexes are associated with pressure. The prefix baro lets us know that we're talking about pressure. For instance, in weather, you hear them talking about a barometer. That's measuring air pressure. Baroreceptors in the carotid sinus are stimulated by a rise in blood pressure. The sensory nerve signal propagates along fibers of cranial nerve 9, which is also known as the glossopharyngeal nerve, and go to the brainstem. The desired response will be to lower blood pressure. So the parasympathetic fibers of cranial nerve 10, or the vagus nerve, are stimulated. The vagus nerve lowers the heart rate. It's actually inhibitory to the heart. It releases acetylcholine to the cardiomyocytes, and what that does is inhibits them. So we decrease heart rate when we stimulate the vagus nerve. Vasomotor neurons are also inhibited, dilating blood vessels. These actions result in the reduction of blood pressure. It's a negative feedback response, and conversely, when blood pressure decreases, we can see the opposite effect. You might have heard of the vasovagal response, where someone has a sharp rise in blood pressure and then they pass out. If you see someone get hit in the neck, there are receptors in the carotid arteries that will be stimulated. Those are baroreceptors. And if you get hit in the neck real hard, those receptors will perceive that as a massive increase in pressure really fast. And so the response is a massive decrease in blood pressure really fast, which will cause someone to pass out or faint. The term chemoreflex refers to a response whose stimulus is a change in blood chemistry. The reflex is carried out by the autonomic nervous system and is mostly in response to blood concentrations of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen ions. Now remember, when we talk about hydrogen ions, we're talking about pH. An increase in the hydrogen ion concentration in a fluid will increase its acidity, which means it'll lower its pH measurement. Chemoreceptors are found in the aortic bodies of the aortic arch and in the carotid bodies of the carotid arteries. Chemoreceptors are stimulated by a drop in oxygen levels and or a rise in acidity and carbon dioxide levels. The result from these chemoreflexes is vasoconstriction, increasing hydrostatic blood pressure, and in turn, gas exchange in the lungs' capillaries. They also increase the respiratory rate, so we breathe faster to accommodate the demand, bringing in oxygen and expelling the carbon dioxide. Now, what we haven't talked about yet is the fact that about 70% of the carbon dioxide in your blood is transported as carbonic acid. So a rise in carbon dioxide actually stimulates a decrease in pH or a rise in acidity. So if we want to normalize our pH, one of the ways we can do that is to exhale more carbon dioxide. Another neural control mechanism is the medullary ischemic reflex, which is specifically focused on the blood supply to the brain. When we're upright, the blood fights gravity to get to the brain, so we need blood pressure to do that. A drop in the brain's perfusion will stimulate receptors in the medulla oblongata. The reflex action, which occurs via the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, targets the heart and blood vessels. The heart rate goes up, and the blood vessels constrict. These two things result in an increased blood pressure, restoring the brain perfusion to its normal levels. And then, of course, we have the endocrine system. We can use the hormones of the endocrine system to influence our blood pressure, and we've talked about some of these in previous episodes. So let's take a look at some of the hormones that we've discussed previously and see how they affect blood pressure. One is angiotensin II from the liver. It's a vasoconstrictor and it increases blood pressure. Also, remember aldosterone. By stimulating sodium ion retention, aldosterone from the adrenal cortex results in water retention, which leads to higher blood volume. And if you put more fluid in a closed system, you're going to increase the pressure. Natriuretic peptides do the opposite by stimulating sodium ion excretion by the kidneys, lowering blood pressure. Remember, antidiuretic hormone from the hypothalamus and stored and released by the posterior pituitary also increases blood pressure by stimulating water retention. And epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla increase blood pressure by directly stimulating vasoconstriction. So remember, we've got three main avenues for control of blood pressure: the neural, the local, and the hormonal. They're all important. And like I said, I like to say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Where your body needs blood, your body should be getting blood. And where your body's not really needing blood at the moment, we can hold off on those places so we can make sure the blood gets to where it needs to go. Okay, so I think blood pressure is a good enough episode. That's a lot of information. Blood pressure is super important, clinically extremely significant, because increases in blood pressure can damage the endothelium of the blood vessels, can cause plaque formation, can narrow the blood vessels, and further increase the pressure. I want to thank you all for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to write to me and to maybe review the podcast or rate the podcast or tell your friends, tell your classmates, tell your professors, tell everybody you can. Hopefully we can get this to as many ears as we can and help as many students as possible with their goal of getting a B or better in A&P. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media. Please take the time to rate the podcast, and don't forget to check out my YouTube channel, Student Help for AP. That's Student Help, the number 4, AP. There's a whole lot of tutor videos on there that I think you're going to find helpful. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where you can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost, tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology, already being used at several colleges and universities.